Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you Brother Chris Ludke.
This is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore the history of Prince Hall Masonry. We've all heard about Prince Hall. It's the sort of thing that everyone's aware of, but we don't have a lot of history that we tend to discuss when it comes to this topic. And this is a problematic topic for many reasons. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of gray area that we're going to be playing with, muddy territory, which is always a lot of fun. But it does make this a particularly important and I believe a very relatable subject for us to deal with. And I am not the expert on this subject. Instead, I have with me a past master of McKinley Lodge, member of Virginia Falls, current district lecturer in District 12, current senior warden at Silas Shepherd, and possibly the fastest triathlete that I know, Worshipful Brother John Schroeder. Thank you for joining us, John.
I'm still trying to figure out the fastest triathlete thing. I
don't know many.
If that, okay, well, then I might, maybe if I'm the only one that you know. Thank you very much for your introduction. I'll just add that I do happen to teach history in Milwaukee. I've been doing that for about 19 years now. So I'm not just a guy off the street, I guess, but I'm also not an expert. So I do have a little background, but I'm not an expert.
And for the listeners, basically, this is going to be an episode of two historians going back and forth on a topic. So go ahead and tune away now if you're looking for something more entertaining. I'm just kidding. It's going to be great. So, Jonathan, what brought you to Prince Hall Masonry? Why did you decide to write this paper and pursue this topic?
So this, it came to me in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, I have been interested in history and Masonry ever since I've been a member of the fraternity. So I have dabbled around in various topics, done a lot of reading on various topics within the Brotherhood, and I enjoyed that part of Masonry. I'm a bit of a history nerd, but more so to the point here is that I am pursuing a master's in history at Marquette University, and I was assigned a paper for a seminar course in the spring of 22 here, and I had the choice of what area I could pursue. It had to be done something in the realm of race in history, and I thought I might as well put these two interests together and pursue the history of and the racial and other relationships between Prince Hall Masonry and the Blue Lodge.
So when we're looking at Prince Hall, let's start at the beginning. How did the original members of Prince Hall actually meet?
So Prince Hall dates its origins back to the late 1700s, to be specific, 1775, when Prince Hall, who was an African-American, what we might have called a freedman, who moved to Boston from Barbados, when he and 14 other guys petitioned for membership in the fraternity and were initiated, passed, and raised into a lodge that was it was what we would call a military lodge. Once in a while, you will see the fraternity have military lodges that pop up with units stationed overseas. The members would not all be members of a single particular lodge. They would be Masons that are a part of that unit, and they would meet together as a lodge while they are stationed in that area. So this lodge was, according to the research that I have here, it has a couple of different numbers. One one source identified it as Lodge number 441, another one, I believe, as Lodge number 59, but it was attached to one of the regiments that was part of the unit commanded by General Gage, the British military that was stationed outside Boston in 1775. So they were raised by this military lodge in March of that year. That was how these guys came into the fraternity. So once they were initiated, obviously this was an extremely volatile time, because those of us that remember our 11th grade history classes would know that early 1775, you had the heat of the revolution coming to a boil. All right. This was literally less or just over 1 month prior to the first shots at Lexington and Concord, which would have been in April, a couple of months ahead of Battle of Bunker Hill, and a time period where we've already had major incidents in the colonies, including like the Boston Tea Party, and you had the Boston Massacre, which already occurred within a few years prior to this. So, needless to say, the British military was not exactly, or they didn't have a heck of a lot of fans in that area at that point in time. So, rather quickly after this, the initiation took place within that next year, that lodge and that regiment were shipped out of Boston. They were moved elsewhere in what would have been the colonies. And they left these guys, these 15 brothers, Prince Hall included, behind. Those brothers were given a warrant by the worshipful master of that military lodge. Assuming what power he possibly could, he gave them a warrant to be able to meet together, perform burials if necessary, Masonic funerals if necessary, and also to march in parades as Masons. However, they were not formally a chartered lodge, a regularly constituted lodge, and so they were not able to have the other rights that lodges would have, such as initiating new members, etc.
So that puts us, about 1776, 1777 at this point?
Yeah, 1776 would have been around the time that the regiment would have moved out.
And so just to sort of recap, we've got 14 brothers, 15 with Prince Hall, if I'm following correctly.
Yes.
And they are raised by this military lodge. And then the military lodge disbands primarily because military aspect of it is being called off to battle elsewhere or to be stationed elsewhere, leaving these brothers behind. And then they are given some form of dispensation that allows them to function at some level.
Correct.
Okay, so with that in mind, do we know of any argument or debate about bringing these brothers in as initiates, especially given that they're African Americans in what one can presume is a primarily white lodge at the time? So
I wasn't able to get a hold of, meeting minutes from this time period. A lot of what I went with here is a kind of speculation on the part of myself and, some of our more learned brethren in terms of Masonic traditions and such. So we can pretty safely assume that the rules in terms of who can be initiated have not changed. So this lodge would have had to have held a vote on these guys prior to being brought in, and you would have had to have had a 100% affirmative vote on their membership. So whatever debate may have taken place within the lodge while in session, I do not have access to. However, if we go by Masonic tradition, yes, they would have had to have had a vote in the affirmative, and whatever their race happens to be, these brothers, when voting on them, would have known that because the petition would have come through them.
Okay. And Now, at this point, we have this sort of partial lodge or semi-formal lodge. How do we get from that point of having sort of a lodge under partial dispensation to the point where they're going to petition as a Grand Lodge?
Well, this is where we start getting a little bit of the racial aspect coming into play. And there's a couple of different sides to this, a couple of different pieces of evidence that would point in some interesting direction. We know that Prince Hall and his brothers repeatedly petitioned for recognition as a separate lodge under the jurisdiction of what might have been a provincial Grand Lodge or the what eventually became the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. We know that he had petitioned there a number of times with no result. One interesting point is that while it might have been a provincial Grand Lodge in 1775, right after becoming members, that these brothers attempted to petition the provincial Grand Lodge there in Massachusetts and for dispensation for a new lodge. And according to the records, this petition was looked on favorably, but it was not acted upon. So unfortunately, the Grand Master of the lodge or of the Masons there at that time was also quite active in the revolution and the revolutionary actions. His name was Brother Joseph Warren, and Brother Warren was active to the point that he was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill and ended up being killed at that battle. So movement on that petition for dispensation was obviously slowed down quite a bit there, and this time period, a very volatile time period during the revolution, while you did have lodges that were meeting and conducting ritual and such, it was not a surprise that some things got put on the back burner. Now, we move ahead just a few years to 1884. And in 1884, Prince Hall decides that his petitions for dispensation for a lodge from the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts are kind of falling on deaf ears, and he makes the decision, or the lodge makes the decision, to petition for dispensation from the Grand Lodge of England. So they establish a communication relationship with one of the provincial Grand Masters over there, what we might call a deputy Grand Master, and they communicate back and forth, and a letter of petition was sent there for approval.
And so just to clarify, at this point, they are still applying for a dispensation to be recognized as a lodge. We haven't gotten to Grand Lodge or anything like that yet.
Correct. In September of that year, September of 1884, according to the records of the Grand Lodge of England, African Lodge number 459 was given their charter by the Grand Lodge of England.
And who came up with the name African Lodge? It seems like that would be problematic if it were to happen today.
I would guess that it would be problematic. However, from what the records indicate, this is the name that they were using for themselves. So they were calling themselves African Lodge number 1, and when they were given dispensation from the Grand Lodge of England, Lodge 459 is what came up in their number. That was just the numbering sequence that they were in.
All right. So why does the Grand Lodge of England, especially after the Revolutionary War, go ahead and approve a dispensation for an American lodge made up of African Americans?
Honestly, there's a lot of speculation that could be attached to this. My particular research didn't go into what their motivations would be. We could say, for example, that this was a group of brothers that were already initiated by a lodge that was in part connected to the Grand Lodge of England. Most of their members, the members of that military lodge, would have been members of the Grand Lodge of England at that time. We could also say that the British might have recognized the issue that this lodge would have had in gaining a charter from the local Grand Lodges. At the time period, we also know just from history that the British were offering African Americans who were fighting with them during the war, they were offering emancipation to them. So there's a lot of different factors that could be at play behind their motivations. The only other bit of speculation that we might be able to attribute to why the British Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England, would have chartered or agreed to provide dispensation for this lodge is that it's kind of funny at this time period, because when the revolution began, many of the provincial Grand Lodges, all of these lodges in the colonies, were tied back to the Grand Lodge of England. At least, most of them that were operating at this point were tied back to the Grand Lodge of England. They were part of provincial Grand Lodges in the different colonies in very kind of a like manner to the way that we understand our operations today. However, when the revolution came about and when the states, or the colonies and eventually states, declared independence, many of those Grand Lodges also essentially declared independence from the Grand Lodge of England. However, the English Grand Lodges may not have actually, looked on that as being something that was necessarily taking place. So recognizing that the brothers who are members of African Lodge here were initiated, passed, and raised into a lodge that was part of, or recognized, they were recognized as members of a Grand Lodge of England lodge, that they would not have necessarily had a huge quandary in granting dispensation to it.
Would the English Grand Lodge have recognized the importance of what they were doing in terms of giving dispensation to an African American lodge?
Bit of speculation on this one. They may have not. I'm not sure. Since we, yourself, myself, and all the rest of us, unfortunately, do not have a TARDIS or a 1984 DeLorean to jump into to go back and sit within these meetings. Not really sure whether or not there was they understood the possible historical implications.
What might we have expected to happen had they petitioned an American Grand Lodge at the same time?
More than likely, you would not see dispensation be granted. Very uneasy time period at this point. The 1780s was a really, really, like most of American history, it was a time period where many of these topics were right on the forefront. These social topics were right at the forefront of the rest of society. So you're looking at the country trying to form itself, trying to figure out what to do about the institution of slavery. You had compromises that were made during what we now know as the Constitutional Convention in the late 1780s about how do we even count slaves within the census. You had arguments at that same convention over whether or not the institution should be a part of our society. More than likely, you would not have seen a American Grand Lodge at this point wade into the waters of recognizing a fully African American brother or a set of brothers for a lodge.
We're in 1784, so we have a lodge now that has dispensation. It's African Lodge. And how do they get from being African Lodge to the point of being a Grand Lodge?
So again, here it's kind of some Masonic tradition comes into play. And quite frankly, you had a number or a series of events that kind of took place within the next 20 years or so after African Lodge received its charter. In that time period, you had numerous other freedmen, in some cases former slaves, in some cases African Americans who had not been born into slavery, who had desired membership in the fraternity. So there was only one place to go for that, and that would be to go to Boston to become a member of the African Lodge. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily lived there or wanted to stay there. So what would happen is that these guys would come in, they would go through their degrees, and they would move back to wherever it was that they were from. And in some cases, there were enough Masons in one area or one general vicinity to be able to meet together and possibly form a lodge of their own. You did have at least two other lodges that grew up in areas outside of Boston that ended up petitioning to African Lodge to be given a dispensation for a lodge of their own. Here's where things get a little bit murky to a point. At this time, since all of the former colonies, now states, all of their what used to be provincial Grand Lodges had separated from the Grand Lodge of England and were their own Grand Lodges, there was only one operating Grand Lodge of England tied lodge left in what is now the United States, and that was African Lodge. So when these other lodges came for and asked for dispensation, African Lodge acted in the role of provincial Grand Lodge and granted those charters. And this was done from the research that I could tell here, this was done in knowledge or with the knowledge of the brothers back in the Grand Lodge of England. So them not having any argument against the actions that Prince Hall was taking here, because he was the master of the lodge and what would have been the de facto provincial Grand Master, they began to operate as separate lodges, and eventually those three lodges came together in the early 1800s and formed what they called the African Grand Lodge. Now, they took on the name of Prince Hall Grand Lodge after the passing of Prince Hall, and the Grand Lodge did that in remembrance of Prince Hall as being a leader and a longtime master lodge.
So you used a term before, freeborn, which brought to mind the requirements of a Mason to be freeborn. How did they understand that in Prince Hall, possibly differently than we might understand it today? And what does that mean?
The argument about being freeborn is probably the biggest, one of the biggest arguments about the legitimacy of Prince Hall in its early stages. Just like many other older texts, there is going to be some argument about what words and meanings happen, what words mean what, and whether or not the word is this or the word is that. And well, if we take a look at the idea of freeborn, there is some argument as to whether it was free or freeborn. So if it's free, if we say the qualification is that they are a man free, well, then that means that something different than a man who is freeborn. So if a person is freeborn, it may have excluded former slaves, but if a man is free, it would not necessarily exclude former slaves. So there could be a bit of a juggling act that went on there. It's not unheard of for groups to adjust what they mean by a statement over the course of time. So, because obviously we would know that very, very, very few African Americans at this point in time in what is now the United States would have been necessarily free-born. They may have left a state of slavery at some point in time. But if the qualification is that they were a man who was free of any type of bondage, then they would qualify as if they were what we would consider to be freedmen or free from slavery or emancipated.
And Prince Hall himself was a freedman having paid off his bondage. Is that correct?
Yes, he was. Prince Hall was, for a time, in bondage. When he moved from Barbados to Boston early on in his life, around his late teens, he entered into a state of servitude in order to pay off those debts, which was a fairly common action at that time for people who were not able to afford to travel. They would enter into what we might call indentured servitude. They would work to pay off their debt to a person or family that paid for something like travel from one place to another.
All right. When we're looking at Prince Hall, they've formed a Grand Lodge, or effectively formed a Grand Lodge. Are they doing this because they feel the need to? Is this an exclusion? Are they desiring to be separate? What's sort of the situation there?
Well, they're recognizing a need. So the Prince Hall Grand Lodge is recognizing the need for, or the desire for, a Masonic body for African Americans, and knowing that if they were to petition a lodge or a Blue Lodge at this time, that they would not be successful in that petition. They felt as though this is something that there is a great amount of prestige that goes along with being a Mason at this time. Many of our founding fathers were Masons. As we all know, Washington, Hamilton, Franklin, etc. were all members of the fraternity, and it would have been a mark of success, or a mark of prestige in life, to be a member. So what we see is that there was a need for it, and essentially Prince Hall and his brothers in this Grand Lodge were filling that void, albeit quite small at this time because there were only a small handful of lodges, but they were fulfilling what they saw as a need in society.
And so what time frame are we up to here? Are we about 1800, a little before, a little after?
Yeah, we're talking about early 1800s. We're talking just in the wake of the War of 1812 area, right up into the 1820s. So right in this neighborhood is when we see the Prince Hall Grand Lodge form and be active.
And so, to offer a recap to listeners, basically we're in that 1812 to 1820 range. We have a Grand Lodge, a Prince Hall Grand Lodge, or what we would recognize as that today. African Lodge has basically taken on that role as Grand Lodge, and things are going to get more difficult, I would assume, moving ahead.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we do not have emancipation in our midst yet. I mean, we are still 40 years away from the Civil War at this point.
Which is what we're going to get into next time when Worshipful Brother Jonathan Schroeder joins us again. This is sort of a good endpoint because we're dealing with the history. We're up to a certain point. And in the next episode, in part 2, we're going to focus on relations between Prince Hall and Blue Lodge Masonry, as well as looking at how Wisconsin became a leader in this area. Until then, thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lidke, and my guest, Worshipful Brother Jonathan Schroeder, and the entire Further Light team. And thank you for allowing us to come with you on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org. That's wimasons.org. Learn more about Freemasonry and access more educational content and further light. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wimasons.org. Once again, that email address is education@wisconsinmasons.wimasons.org. Thank you for listening.